Hey everyone. I've been wanting to shoot a more in-depth painting tutorial and thought my recently completed Alpha Legion Dreadnought would be a great choice. Here's a list of the paints I'll be using. This is also the first time I've been using any of the Games Workshop contrast paints. I was eager to see how they'd airbrush. I load up the airbrush with some black primer from Badger's Style No Res line. To keep the length of this tutorial in check, I'll only be sharing the top part of the chassis for this segment, but I do give the entire model an all overcoat with the primer. If you haven't tried any of this primer yet before, I can't recommend it enough. It goes on smooth, straight from the bottle. After the black has dried a bit, I come back over with some gray primer. I do this for a few reasons. I want a lighter base for the metallics, but also a little bit of pre-shading as well. Not much since the metallics go on a bit heavy. Now that we have some primer down, it's time to start laying down some metallics for our base. I start off with some Vallejo Game Air gunmetal. I'll coat the entire model with this, and it'll serve as our dark metal base. Next, I follow up with some Scale 75 thrash metal. I use this as a sort of slight zenithal highlight, top down. Any mid-tone metallic would work here. To finish off the metallics, I bring in some Vallejo Model Air steel and further lighten up the top-down zenithal highlights. I love this silver so much, it's my go-to lately. Now the fun begins. Load up the airbrush with some Pterodon turquoise contrast paint. You can put this in the airbrush straight, but I did lower the PSI on the air compressor. You want to go really light with this at first and build up the color intensity. The fun part with airbrushing these paints is the more you put down in one area, the darker it'll get. Great for adding shade to lower segments. But don't worry too much about being neat at this stage, as we'll clean up the skeleton of the chassis later. The other cool thing about contrast paints is that you can use it as a pin wash for your armor and trim details. I also throw on some gloss varnish from Vallejo. Here's a quick look at all the armor panels coated in the turquoise. Now that our base color is down, it's time to clean up with overspray. First up is the base metallic again, Vallejo Game Air gunmetal. Even though this is an airbrush ready paint, I use it by brush all the time. No need to dilute it, and it always goes on clean. Once the core skeleton is covered, I use the same gunmetal on all the trim and detail bits for this dread. Just be careful when you're doing this bit, as you don't want to mess up the turquoise layer. Next up, I bust out my favorite metallic, Vallejo Model Air Steel. I use a dry brush to stipple the skeleton out of the chassis and carefully on some of the more raised detail and trim. Once this is dry, I wash the metallics with a mix of brown and black washes. This mix was a leftover from my Death Guard Armies on Parade display. It consists of Vallejo brown and black washes and some gloss varnish. Once the first wash is dry, I bring in some Nuln Oil to go over the trim and details of the armor panels. I also throw a little extra into the working parts of the legs and chassis as well. There are these little tassels featured around the armor panels, and I wanted to use this as a way to add another color to the model. I picked Vallejo Game Air Warlord Purple as the base for these. Then I used some Juchi Violet from Games Workshop to cover them. Next I combined Vallejo Squid Pink and Warlord Purple to touch up the highlights. Bringing out Vallejo Steel once more to bring up the metallics after the wash. I stipple the steel over the skeleton and some trim. Then using a brush with a good tip, clean up the trim and details. To finish up this tutorial, I wanted to share a quick trick on how I easily do eyes, especially on dreadnoughts. You want to use some pure white. I'm using dead white from Vallejo, and I put a layer into the socket. After the white has dried, using a glaze, blood letter from Games Workshop in this case, I fill in the socket and let it dry. It'll create an easy depth to the lens, but you can always touch it up with some other paints. Now that all the panels are finished, I glue the model together. This way I can see how it looks and gauge where I need to add more shadows or details. And here's the final model. I went in with some golds in the emblems, added some scratches to the armor with some Vallejo steel, and some pigments near the feet for a dusty effect. I've uploaded the full video showcase of the model that you could check out too. If you found this tutorial useful, be sure to share, like, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in.